This video is sponsored by Everwinter. More about them later in the video. How many times in your games of 10th edition 40k have you heard something like this?
Oh, hang on a second. The Rangers are gonna skittle.
With the game's new focus on player interaction, reactive moves are more common in Warhammer 40k in 10th edition than ever before. They allow you to respond to your opponent's moves, muck with their plans, and make decisions even when it's not your own turn. So understanding how they work and how to use them to the best of your ability is key to succeeding in Warhammer 40k. So today we're going to be talking about reactive moves and a new variety that's buried within the depths of the Space Marine Codex that is more powerful than any of these other abilities that we've seen in the past. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another rules breakdown video. Today we're going to be talking about reactive moves. Now, this isn't a game term, but is used by the community generally to refer to moves that are triggered by your opponent's actions. We're going to be breaking down three different types of reactive moves today, those being Scuttle Moves, which is another sort of colloquialism, but those are moves that are triggered in response to enemy movement, Blood Surge Moves, which are moves that are triggered in response to enemy ranged attacks, and last but certainly not least, Charge Response Moves, which is brand new in the Space Marine Codex and is one of the most powerful types of reactive effects in Warhammer 40,000, with the ability to absolutely disrupt and destroy your opponent's turn. So let's dive in, and remember, if you enjoy this style of content, drop a like in the video, subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube stuff that every YouTuber says, because we've been programmed by the Illuminati to recite the same mantra at the beginning of every video.
The prophecy is true.
Now, first, a little bit of a note about these moves. They are almost entirely composed of regular, normal moves. This means that reactive moves, with some exceptions, are governed by the rules that restrict normal movement and are restricted by the movement characteristic of the unit performing the move. If your movement characteristic is less than the total allowed by the effect or stratagem, you will move up to your movement characteristic in inches. Now, the first move that we're going to talk about are Scuttle Moves. These are moves that are triggered in response to enemies ending a movement within a distance of them. Typically, it's 9 inches, and sort of the poster child for this mechanic is the Gladius Task Force stratagem for Space Marines, Squad Tactics. This allows your units, if they're infantry or mounted, to move d6 inches or potentially a full 6 if you are in Tactical Doctrine, in response to an enemy ending a normal move, advance, or fallback within 9 inches of them. It's pretty simple, and basically all of these Scuttle style of moves will be using this template. These are available both from stratagems like Squad Tactics in a wide variety of factions, and special abilities that are on units' datasheets. Units like Eldar Rangers and Tyranid Termagants have these abilities baked in, but there are some subtle differences between a stratagem-applied variety of this effect and the one they gain from an ability on their datasheet. Now, first off, we'll talk about stratagems because they're a little bit more restricted. Stratagems will usually have a defined timing when they can be used, and abilities like these ones are typically restricted to being used during your opponent's movement phase, meaning that they're going to be used in response to your opponent's normal movement phase activations. This means that effects like other reactive moves that move an enemy unit outside of their movement phase do not typically trigger stratagems like this. On the flip side, datasheet abilities that allow for reactive moves don't usually have this timing restriction, so they are able to be used in response to out-of-phase enemy movement. As long as that movement consists of a normal move, advance, or fall back, you can use them in response to things like enemy reactive moves or abilities like Temporal Surge that allows a unit to move in their shooting phase. Now, this opens up a lot of possibilities for these styles of reactive movement. You can use them if an enemy is getting close to you to make their charges more difficult, or you can even use them to make their charges easier by physically move blocking them. For example, if you have multiple of your units that are in range to be attacked by enemies, using a reactive move to push one of them forward and physically block the enemy charge lanes to that second unit can make it difficult or impossible for your opponent to get into melee with them. You can also use them to gain additional position or movement for objectives, moving additional units so that you get more objective control on an objective marker, or moving them into position to get things like action secondaries or maneuver secondaries like engage in all fronts or behind enemy lines on the subsequent turn is also important to keep in mind when using these abilities. You don't simply have to use them to pull back from your opponent or to escape out of line of sight. You can also use them to move aggressively forward and control your position on the table. When trying to counterplay moves like this, it's also important to remember that they are consisted of normal moves. So you can block off the areas where your opponent can make these reactive moves by simply putting your own engagement range there. Free movement is a valuable resource in Warhammer 40k, especially when it's outside your normal movement phase, so refraining from triggering these in situations where you don't need to is also important to keep in the back of your mind. As the year grows colder and there's not but the icy nip of Jack Frost outdoors, what's better than to curl up with a hot mug of cocoa next to the roar of indoor central heating and one of the largest miniature gaming events of the year? Everwinter is one of the many amazing events presented by Wicked Dicey. Veterans of this channel might recognize some of Wicked Dicey's past events like Everwinter 2022 and Ironweld, which both supported the channel and I covered on stream. They were amazing events, and Wicked Dicey always puts on an amazing show, but this year they are coming back bigger and better than ever. Everwinter is a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza now at a new location in Waltham, Massachusetts. This gaming convention features competitive play for a frankly dizzying number of miniature games, including a full-size Age of Sigmar GT, a Star Wars Legion Championship, and events for other games such as Malifaux, Infinity, X-Wing, Armada, Conquest, Song of Ice and Fire, Middle-earth strategy battle game, and many more, including, let's be honest, the one that you're probably the most interested in, a full-scale Warhammer 40k major. Last year, Everwinter brought together close to 100 40k players for their major, and this year promises to be even bigger. If competition isn't quite your style, there is also a variety of casual and narrative events to choose from, as well as a variety of board games and hobby workshops so you can hone those paintbrush skills. I couldn't be more excited for Everwinter 2023, and I will be there all weekend. So please come and join me December 8th through 10th at the Westham Waltham, Boston, and head on over to wickeddicey.com/Everwinter for more information and to get your tickets today. I'll see you on the battlefield, gamers. Now, there are a couple other styles of reactive moves in this category that are a little different than the ones that we've just spoken about. One of them is from the Grey Knights Index. This is Mists of Deimos from the Teleport Assault Detachment. This stratagem has the same timing as a lot of these other reactive moves, but has a totally different effect. While it does allow for a reactive move of up to 6 inches to reposition your units and get them out of charge range or out of line of sight for shooting, it also has a very special secondary effect that's optional. If the unit being selected by the stratagem has Deep Strike, it can be placed into strategic reserves instead. This means that the next turn, if it's battle round 2 or onwards, they can then be redeployed back onto the tabletop using the Deep Strike ability. This is an extremely powerful version of this ability, since instead of simply being farther away from your opponent or trying to get out of line of sight or charge range, they are simply no longer on the table. They're not eligible to be targeted by anything. That also then gives the Grey Knights player a lot of control over where they come back and where their unit is going to be set up on the table, and can compound with their Teleport Assault ability innately. This fits with the general Grey Knights theme of unparalleled mobility, especially when it comes to reserve and Deep Strike effects, and is simply an uber version of other reactive moves that we've talked about previously. Do you want to come up? Now, while it's not a reactive move per se, I also think it's important to talk about a stratagem like Phantasm here. Phantasm is the highlight of the Eldari Battle Host detachment. It's a stratagem that is used at the end of your opponent's movement phase and allows you to move one of your units, making a normal move with them. The important thing about Phantasm is that it doesn't require a trigger, which is why it's so powerful. You can use it to escape from charges or escape from line of sight, but it doesn't require you to be near enemy units, and you can also use it to gain board position or gain board control, even if there aren't any enemy units even tangentially close to you. This stratagem is incredibly powerful, both at pushing your units more forward aggressively in order to gain control of the table and put their short-range infantry units into range, or moving them back out of line of sight or charge range, making them extremely difficult to pin down, or simply dodging units around objectives and responding to where the opponent's line of sight is. So again, while it's not technically a reactive move, it is still important to keep in mind when you're discussing effects like this, because it works kind of like a reactive move in many situations. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the next type of reactive move, Blood Surge moves. Now, this terminology comes from the Khorne Berserker's datasheet, who has Blood Surge as an ability on that datasheet. These are moves that are triggered in response to enemy ranged attacks targeting the unit. Other examples can be found on units like the Wolfguard Battle Leader on Thunderwolf, Tyrannid Carnifexes, and in the Tyrannid Unending Swarm Detachment ability. And they all basically follow the exact same templating. They trigger during enemy shooting activations, meaning that they're going to only take place during their shooting phase. They will require a number of those shooting attacks to target the subject unit, and will typically require some of those attacks to be converted. While some of these effects trigger in response to just simply the unit being targeted, Khorne Berserkers and the Unending Swarm, for example, will both require your opponent to have killed models in that unit with that shooting attack in order to use the Blood Surge move. Now, the effect of these moves is to move that unit d6 inches towards the nearest enemy. However, there is a lot of nuance in exactly how this is calculated. First of all, they get to ignore the normal movement phase restriction of not being able to move into engagement range of enemy units. You're able to engage enemies with these moves, which means they are one of the few ways of putting a unit into melee without requiring a charge or a combat phase movement. On top of this, this is also a way to engage enemy units without allowing them to charge. Because the player whose turn it is not always takes the first activation during the fight phase, after all the fight's first combats have been resolved, you can then select whatever unit engaged with Blood Surge to be the first fighter during that non-charging remaining combat step. So let's talk about Blood Surge moves and exactly how their movement is resolved, because it works in a bit of a different fashion than you would think just looking at the wording of the ability. It requires the unit resolving the Blood Surge movement to move as close as possible to the closest enemy unit. Now, in this situation, we have a tactical squad shooting at these Khorne Berserkers, and they've killed a couple of the Khorne Berserkers in their shooting phase, thus triggering the Blood Surge movement. Now, the distance between units is always measured from the two models in those units that are the closest. So in this case, this Khorne Berserker is the closest model to the Tactical Marines, which means in order for this unit to move as close as possible to them, this model would be getting closer to them, moving directly towards the Tactical Sergeant who's in the front. However, once that criteria has been achieved, the rest of the unit is simply resolved like a normal move. So we're resolving this Blood Surge movement of a 3, that's what we rolled on our dice here, and the closest model has to move 3 inches directly towards, as close as possible, to this Tactical Marine Sergeant, which will, fortunately for them, bring them in engagement range, which is exactly where Khorne Berserkers want to be. From there, the criteria of these units being as close as possible has been achieved, which means that the rest of the models in this unit, because that close as possible criteria is determined from the two units, not each individual model, are free to move wherever they want. So, for example, we have this objective over here that these Scout Marines are trying to hold on to, maybe for a secondary objective. We can then move these Khorne Berserkers onto that objective in order to control it. We then have to reestablish coherency, which means we'll probably have to move some models in the middle here in order for the unit to remain coherent, and that is a perfectly legal Blood Surge move. So as you can see, as long as you fulfill that criteria of the closest model in the Blood Surging unit moving directly towards the closest enemy model in the nearest enemy unit, the rest of your movement is very free, and you can actually use that to do a lot of funky stuff during your opponent's turn that they're going to have to consider and play around if they don't want to get absolutely hosed by a lucky 6 on a Blood Surge movement. This gets even crazier for Khorne Berserkers, who can potentially be triggering Blood Surge multiple times, where new enemy units are the closest enemy unit that then those Khorne Berserkers will move towards in an attempt to get units into engagement range, stop enemies from shooting, and allow themselves to fight first in that subsequent fight phase. On top of that, there are some restrictions on the number of times they can be done. Well, Khorne Berserkers and the Unending Swarm Detachment ability can actually be performed multiple times per shooting phase, with the downside that they can't perform them while battle shocked, allowing that unit, if they continuously lose models over the course of a phase, to continuously make Blood Surge moves. Units like Carnifexes or the Wolfguard Battle Leader are restricted to once per phase, and in the Battle Leader's case, only once per game. Regardless of the number of times that these abilities trigger, they are incredibly important to keep in mind, and especially if you have effects that allow that unit to move otherwise outside of their normal sequence, you can actually stack those together, making reactive moves to move the unit closer to the enemy, and then triggering a potential Blood Surge move to move into melee with the Blood Surge's special ability. And with that moves us on to the final form of reactive move that we're going to be covering in this video, the Calculated Feint. This comes entirely from a single stratagem within the depths of the Space Marine Codex from the Vanguard Strike Force detachment, and is, in my opinion, the most powerful version of reactive moves available in 40k. Maybe one step down from Mists of Deimos, but this one has the potential to immediately end games. in a lot of situations. Calculated Feint is wholly distinct from all of the other types of reactive moves that we've talked about so far, in that, like Blood Surge moves, it responds to your unit being targeted, but it responds to your unit being targeted in the charge phase. The effect of the stratagem is to give that unit a d6-inch move or a 6-inch move if it is a light infantry, like a Phobos or Scout unit. Now, before we go too far in this discussion, one thing that's important to keep in mind is a clarification within the rules commentary document for 10th edition 40k. This document specifies that if a unit has an ability that triggers in response to a charge that would then make that unit ineligible to be a target of that charge, the charger can then select a new target. The eligibility requirement for a charge is that you are within 12 inches of the charging unit. That is, in fact, the only requirement specified. This means that it is possible if, for example, you have a unit that's 7 inches away from your opponent, trigger a 6-inch calculated feint move, and move directly backwards to be 13 inches away from the charger, meaning that they are outside 12 inches and you are no longer an eligible target. That would allow them to choose a new target and attempt to complete their charge anyway. However, this feint being so calculated gives you total control over where you move your own models, meaning that it is possible to make that charge difficult or impossible to complete while remaining an eligible charge target. So we're jumping into TTS here to break down exactly how this mechanic works and the ways that you can both try to defeat it and use it to your advantage. So we have the Swarm Lord here, and he's got a pretty juicy charge into the Space Marine Scouts. Got a little bit of a longer charge into the Predator over here, but he's going to try to get to the Scouts first because they are closer. In response to that, assuming that we're in the Vanguard Strike Force, these Scouts can then use Calculated Feint to, because they're a light infantry, a Scout unit, move 6 inches away or move 6 inches in whatever direction they want to in response to that charge declaration. So the Swarm Lord declares them as a charge target, the stratagem gets used, and the Scouts are going to move 6 inches directly away to try to escape the Swarm Lord. Now this is going to put them 13 inches away from the Swarm Lord now. So the eligibility to charge requires that you are within 12 inches of the target, which means that they are no longer an eligible target. So thanks to the rules commentary, the Swarm Lord is now able to redeclare a charge target so he can go in and try for this 8-inch charge on this Predator instead. Now that's one of the classic use cases of the stratagem. It saves the Scouts, but there is a situation where you could potentially allow that Swarm Lord to get into another unit. However, what we want to do is have the Swarm Lord be stranded out in the front here and laser beam to death by the Predator instead. So what we can do is, because we just need the Swarm Lord to be within 12 inches of the Scouts, is actually move the Scouts to stay within 11.9 inches of the Swarm Lord. That makes them an eligible charge target because they are within 12. However, it is going to be an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, charge for the Swarm Lord to complete, because he can't move into engagement range of this Predator because he didn't declare it as a charge target. These guys are still an eligible target. With a charge roll, he has to get within an inch of the Scouts in order for that charge to succeed. And that's going to be very difficult because he has to get probably here in order for that charge to succeed, which means he could probably do it if he rolled boxcars, but if he has to go any farther around the Predator, then his charge would automatically fail. Now let's say we're in a similar situation where we're right up close and personal with the enemy. The Scouts are out in front of this ruin, they're doing an action, they're deploying some teleport hummers or something like that, and we still have the Predator over here, which could be an eligible redeclaration target if the Scouts became an uneligible target. We're being charged by the Genestealers and maybe the Swarm Lord in here, and are going to use Calculated Feint on the Scouts in response to that. Now this gives them a 6-inch move, and what we're going to do is use the ruins behind them to physically interpose between the models and the chargers. This is called wall screening. This is a age-old technique to try to prevent charges. What we can do with these Scouts and their reactive move is put them in a position where their engagement range extends to the limit of the wall, but not farther than it. This makes it so that in order to engage them in melee, you have to be inside the wall. However, we can create a situation because of the thickness of the wall and the thickness of the Scouts' bases with a 6-inch move that not even the Genestealers would be able to place themselves inside the wall, and they would have to move to this position in order to get in. So for example, we have these Scouts. Their engagement range extends right to here, so in order to engage them, you'd have to be standing at this limit. That limit is inside the wall, and the Genestealer's base is too big to stand inside this area. That means that in response to that, this Genestealer charge goes from being what was probably a 4 or 5 to what is likely a 10-inch charge to get a model all the way around here, a 10 or 11 inch charge to actually engage these models in melee. And even then, these Genestealers are going to have to move all the way around and use their piling consolidate moves. Probably not get enough attacks into the scouts to actually get to grips with them. And you can imagine if this wall was closed off as well, or the Genestealers were slightly farther away, that would be, while the scouts are still an eligible charge target because they're within 12, an impossible charge because even a 12-inch roll on the charge dice would not get them into melee. In this case as well, if the Swarm Lord was declaring that charge, he is a monster, so he would have to go all the way around the walls. He's not even allowed to pass through the walls at any point, meaning that this charge is almost certainly impossible for him, because he would probably take about 13 inches to get to here. He would not be able to get into engagement of the scouts, and he can't engage the Predator because he didn't declare it as his charge target. So in response to one of these two charges, the scouts can move to be relatively safe, making it an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, charge for these models, and cause that charge to automatically fail, even though they're still within 12 inches of the charging model. Now, you can also essentially create a similar situation with physical models as well. If we have a more important squad in here, something like a Tactical Marine squad that we want to protect from enemy charges, so we have the Swarm Lord over here who could charge into these Tactical Marines. We place one of our Phobos units, one of our light scout units, or, I mean, any infantry unit that is eligible to receive the benefit of this stratagem, although it is better on the scout. We can use them to sort of body block off our more powerful units that we want to protect. That would force the Swarm Lord, if he wants to engage the Tactical Marines and not make a super long charge to go around the side, to declare the scouts as a charge target, because he would have to move into their engagement range in order to engage the tactical squad. That allows the scouts to then be chosen by calculated feint, and what we can do is actually use that to move the scouts to separate them from the Tactical Marines. Either move them forward to body block the Swarm Lord's movement, or move them backwards behind the Tactical Marines. What this does is it actually causes the Swarm Lord's multi-charge to fail, because in order for a multi-charge to be successfully completed, the charge roll has to be sufficient to bring the Swarm Lord into engagement range of both units that he declared. He can't move through the Tactical Marines, which means in order to engage both of these units, he would have to be standing somewhere over here, which is not a possible movement for a monster like the Swarm Lord. So that would create a situation where, even if these Tactical Marines are standing directly in front of him, if he declared the scouts as the charge target, he's not able to get them in melee, and he's then just going to sit there and get multi-gunned to death by the Tactical Marine unit. Now, stratagems like calculated feint have existed in the past. This does mean that the counterplay to these style mechanics does exist. The first one, and the most obvious one, is that this stratagem cannot be used if they are currently engaged in melee, meaning that getting to engage them without declaring charges from your most powerful combat units is a good way to stop them from being absolutely blanked by calculated feint moves that bring them outside of a possible charge. A good way to do this is to try to make long bomb charges from your backline units. So for example, we have something like these Ripper Swarms here. They can deep strike onto the table 9 inches away from enemies and just go for 9-inch charges. If you have other units, just regular utility units or chaff, you can declare charges on this unit and attempt to make a long charge in order to pin them in melee and then charge with your closer unit. 2 units coming in from deep strike. We have 2 shots as a 9-inch charge on these models. You can get 2 or 3 or 4 tries to make a really long 9, 10, and 11-inch charge into that unit. Once you do so, they are stuck there. They're not able to use the reactive move, and suddenly they can be eaten by your other chargers. In addition to that, the reactive move requires the unit itself to be declared as the charge target, which means it is possible to engage them in melee even if you haven't declared them. So, for example, if we have something like the Swarm Lord coming up over here and charging this Predator, but the Predator is killed in melee, or the Swarm Lord isn't able to base it with its charge move, it could then pile into the scout unit and then make its attacks targeting them, even though it didn't declare them as a target. You're able to attack enemy units in your engagement range even if you didn't charge them, and you're able to pile into them and bring them into melee as long as you're not basing any enemy units. So if you get a situation where you can charge into melee and then remain not in base contact, you can potentially bring these guys in with the pile-in move. Just keep in mind that it has to go towards the closest enemy and base if possible. So you would be moving towards the unit that you actually charged and trying to engage the scouts with that movement. It's a little bit easier with a multi-model unit like these Genestealers. They could declare the Predator. If they do make that charge, they would end up making a charge something like this, keeping their models outside of engagement range of the scouts, and then when it comes to their pile-in, they could pile into the scouts to make their attacks targeting it. Because they didn't declare the scouts as the charge target, the scouts are never able to use calculated feint in response, and so they just have to sit there and eat the attacks from the Genestealer unit. This being a normal move as well has all of the restrictions of a normal move. If you're able to surround them or move units around or near them, you can restrict the position at which they can make their calculated feint move. For example, in this situation, they would then have to move around the Genestealers that are interposing, and that would make it difficult or impossible for them to escape the Swarmlord's charge, and the Swarmlord could then get into melee with them. So if you have very fast units or units that are already in position to prevent these charges, these reactive moves from happening, then that can potentially facilitate your more combat-oriented units from getting into melee with them. But as always, the biggest threat of calculated feint is causing those powerful melee units' charges to fail. So any way that you can find to get around this stratagem without declaring the charge from your big units and allowing your opponent to fizzle that charge is incredibly valuable and super important. In any case, as you can see, while there is counterplay to the calculated feint, it is incredibly powerful. And if your opponent is able to roll a high enough movement on the calculated feint reactive move, they can ruin your entire turn if you're not prepared for it. And if you haven't set up a good position for your combat units to get into melee. Leaving a combat unit stranded out in the middle of the table with no charge targets and not engaged in melee, not forcing enemy units to fall back from it, makes them easy pickings for the Vanguard Strike Force, who can then use their mobility and powerful shooting attacks to wipe that unit off the table without having lost anything besides a command point for the stratagem. And with that, those are the reactive moves that is my discussion on reactive moves in Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section what you feel about these mechanics, if you enjoy their inclusion in the game or think that they offer too much control to the defending player. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Everwinter for sponsoring this video, and thanks to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.